All right, everybody, welcome to our September webinar. So this would be, I guess, our third quarter of the year webinar. We do these every quarter. Welcome. This is Revolution Rental Management's quarterly webinar series. My name is Todd Orchide. We'll do introductions here in just a second. But just to give you a brief introduction to the topic we're going to be talking about today, we are going to be doing a deep dive into finding a great tenant. So we're going to be talking a lot about how you screen residents, the things to look for, things not to look for, some of the problem areas, especially nowadays with modern technology. So we're going to dive into all that kind of stuff. Two of us here, myself and Zach Chapman, who again, we'll introduce ourselves here in just a second. Just giving everybody a minute to get in. But I think we'll go ahead and kick things off. So we'll start off with our introductions. Everybody, like I said, my name is Todd Orchide. I am the CEO of Revolution Rental Management. We have been in business since 2008, so we're one of the longest serving property management companies in the Atlanta metro area. I have run the business since 2012. It was a family business. I took it over from my father. Zach, who you're about to meet, has been here for many years, off and on. And has currently working with us as our business development manager. So I'll let him explain what that is. But Zach, why don't you do a little intro?
Thank you. Yes, I am Zach Chapman. I am Revolution Rental Management's business development manager. Basically, I bring on new accounts. I'm perfect, and I'm very good at it. So I help grow the company. I talk to new leads and bring people on board who need their properties managed and who need us to help place good, high quality tenants. That's part of what we do is we place tenants. So I bring on the accounts, and then Todd and the leasing team, they handle the marketing and screening, and I do help bring on the accounts though. And I've been licensed since 2016. I have been in a business development role almost 3 years, going on 3 years. So happy to be here. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, of course. And prior to that, Zach had done a lot of other things in property management. So he's got the full background in all of this, which is why he's great to have on these calls also. But let's do our deep dive into finding a great tenant. So we'll start off talking about what I think personally is the most important part of a resident screening or an applicant screening, and that is actually verifying income. I know a lot of people mistakenly think that it's all about the credit report, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as to why that's kind of a misnomer. But in my view, verifying that someone actually makes the money is the absolute most important thing about this. And traditionally, this has always been a question of looking at documents. That's traditionally how you always did this. If you go back years ago, how do you verify income? You look at pay stubs, or you look at tax returns, employment verification letters, that kind of stuff. There's a whole lot of reasons why that doesn't work really well. So nowadays we do things a little bit differently. What we do is we actually will positively verify income. And what that basically means is we connect to their bank account. So if someone applies to rent from us, we have a system that we use that will actually connect to every bank account that the tenant has or that the applicant has. It'll check not only how much money they have in the system or in the bank, but it will also check to see how much money is coming in on a regular basis. So it's checking to see what their recurring income is. So it'll actually screen out one-time payments and just show us, what does this person make on an ongoing basis every single month, consistently, month after month after month, because that is really what tells us whether this person can pay rent or not. Zach, how important would you say this is as far as, verifying whether someone is actually going to be a good tenant or not? Where would you put income verification sort of on that hierarchy of importance?
At the top. There's so many things you can screen for. Income is the most important one. I believe we're looking for 2.5 times the monthly rent and income.
Three for standard deposit. Yeah, if they want to only pay the normal deposit.
Some private landlords do 2.5. We are at 3. So they need to make 3 times the monthly rent and income in order just to get approved, just to get their foot in the door. It's 3 times because on average, people have different things they pay for. They have car notes, they have insurance, and 3 times is that good number for us. But yeah, I would say the most important thing you could do is make sure they make enough money to live there and pay rent on time.
Yeah, this is what's going to do the most to prevent evictions. But I would also say, just in general, it's the most to make sure that someone is actually going to be responsible. Because if someone is coming to rent from you and they only make 2 times the rent, that's probably a pretty good indication that they just don't have a good hold on their finances, just in general. They don't understand how much money they're going to need to be able to support this property. So, aside from just being able to afford the rent, it's also a good indication of just how responsible is this person likely to be. And that'll come into play into how they take care of the property. Do they follow the rules? Do they, do what the HOA says they have to do? All of that stuff really comes into it once you figure out how responsible somebody is. So yeah, 3 times the rent is our standard. So, if you want to only pay 1 month's rent for a security deposit, and you don't want any other fees or anything associated with it for anything, you need to make at least 3 times the rent. We do have some flexibility there. So if someone makes a little bit less than that, they can pay a bigger deposit. It'll reduce the landlord's risk that way. So that's something that landlords can do to kind of mitigate that risk. If they've kind of got someone who they don't quite make the money, but their credit's fantastic, they've got no problems with their rental history, criminal is good, if everything else looks good, but they've just got an income issue, then you can do something to mitigate your risk, like bumping up the security deposit. We will do that. But in general, this is really the most important thing you want to look for. You want to double check to make sure the person makes the money they need. Now, I will say, if you're an individual landlord out there, you can't really do what we do and connect to their bank account. That's just not something that's available to you, because you have to actually apply to a company and get something that's called a PLAD integration that will connect to banks. And individual landlords usually just aren't able to do that. None of the services really provide that. So that's why one of the main reasons why it's important to have a licensed property manager to do this sort of thing. So I throw that out there first, as income verification is the number one thing, because in our view, that's the most important part. But let's talk about some of the other things you want to keep an eye out for. So eviction history. Zach, where would you say that this falls in the hierarchy of needs here for a good tenant?
This is, I would say, more important than income, because even if they make enough money to live there and pay rent on time, we do not want to rent with someone who's not going to pay their bills, especially their rent. So very important that they, I believe it's no unpaid landlords, no unpaid evictions on their report. Now we can interact with them if they have an unpaid landlord, but we're not going to rent to them until we know they have paid that bill off. So very important.
Yeah, I mean that's the important thing there. I mean, there's nothing wrong necessarily with talking to somebody and finding out if is there something they can do to resolve this. So they've got an unpaid eviction on their history. Maybe they owe $1,000 to a prior landlord from an eviction. Okay, go and pay it. If you go and pay that, then that indicates that you're responsible. You've gotten over whatever problem you had. Maybe this eviction was 4 years ago. But if you let an eviction go and you don't ever pay it off, that's a pretty good indication that you haven't learned your lesson. That this is something you're probably going to do again if you get yourself in a financial bind and you're not going to pay the rent. You just don't find it important. So, like Zach said, for us, this is a hard limit for us. If you have an unpaid eviction on your credit report, on your background check, we will not rent to you at all. There's no fee you can pay. There's no extra thing you can go through to get it approved. That is just a barrier that you can't get past with us until you get that eviction paid off. Now, one thing I will point out to people, though, is there are unfortunately some states who have put some limitations in place where you can't see if someone had an eviction. So, for example, in California, if someone got evicted, I think it was during about a 2-year period of time around COVID, those records have basically been wiped. So you cannot see if that person got an eviction if they had lived in California. So this isn't perfect. Even if you run a full background check, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to see every eviction that there's been. There could be states and localities that prevent you from seeing it, but you always want to check for it. This is, like Zach said, this is even more important than income verification, is making sure that someone hasn't stiffed a prior landlord, because, there are some bills, we'll talk about other collections accounts here in a minute, but if someone doesn't pay a cell phone bill, that's a little bit different than not paying a landlord their rent. What we're concerned about is, are they actually going to pay the rent that they're supposed to pay? So I did want to jump real quick. We had a question from someone who had dropped a question in the comments and said, as far as income verification, what if they use someone else's credentials? That is an indication of tenants that were placed in my property. When it comes to income verification, no, that's not something that they can actually do, because one of the things that our system will do is check the name verification. So they're going to make sure that the name on the bank account is matching the name that they're applying with. So we're checking that if we're doing that integration. If you're having to do this on your own as a landlord and figure out, it's a little bit more difficult to verify income. But for us, that's some of the information that actually comes across through the Plaid integration. It tells us who owns this bank account. Is it the person who's actually applying for the property or not? So we're actually able to check on that and make sure that someone's not fraudulently applying for that sort of thing. So okay, very good. So that's eviction history. That's income verification. Let's talk next about just general collections accounts. So this is other forms of collection, not landlords who are owed money. This is someone who owes a utility bill or a cell phone bill, a car loan, something like that. They've got a collection on their account when you pull their credit report. How important is that? So, when we look at this, we're basically looking at what kind of account is this that they're behind on. We basically aren't going to fault someone for a medical bill or for student loans. So we basically kind of look past that. And the reason for that is, people get crazy medical bills. That's a reality in America. Unfortunately, whatever your politics, we all know that it's just a reality in this country that you can get hit with huge medical bills, even if you have insurance, depending on what the situation is. And sometimes those can be into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, or worse. If you get cancer, you could be in the millions of dollars on these things. So, we're not going to tell someone they can't have a place to live because they went and got treatment for their cancer. That's not something we're going to do. But I will say, if someone is not paying their car loan, that's a pretty bad indication. If they've got a current active car loan and they aren't paying those bills, Zach, you've done application screenings before in a prior role. How would that look to you if you were running that application?
Red flag, immediate red flag. Yeah. If they're not paying their bills, now, I would hope someone's paying their car note. I think, we could still possibly approve an application, but they're going to go under the magnifying glass. We're going to take a closer look. We're going to make sure everything is on the table, above board, before we consider approving them. So, yeah, just right off the bat, not paying your bills, credit card bills, car note, that's a big red flag. They need to prove that income, and they need to prove they're responsible.
Yeah, those are big. I would also say that, utility bills are probably another one we pay attention to, because those can become, if someone doesn't pay their utilities, that's a pretty good sign that's not a very responsible kind of person. That's, if you can't keep the lights on and the water running in your house, probably not a very good tenant. And that can actually lead to property damage. If you let the heat get shut off in the middle of winter, that can lead to a pipe bursting. So, we have ways to make sure that doesn't happen if we're managing the property, because the way we manage utilities. But if you're an individual landlord, that's a huge, huge problem. So you got to keep an eye on that sort of thing. So, always pay attention to those collection accounts. For us, the way we do it is we use a scoring system that determines all this stuff. So that would be factored into our score. And if someone has this collections account, it's going to reduce their credit or their application score. And that's either going to result in them not getting approved or them having to pay a bigger deposit or something like that. So, you don't necessarily have to just outright deny someone if they've got, say, an unpaid cell phone bill or an unpaid car payment. You could charge a bigger deposit. It depends on the circumstances, but just make sure you're checking for this, because it's a very good indication of someone's responsibility. We did have another question pop up in the chat asking about eviction history. It says, if a tenant does cash for keys, their credit is not affected. That is actually a very good point. So for those who don't know what cash for keys is, this is basically if someone gets behind on the rent, sometimes a landlord or even a mortgage provider, for that matter, can say, all right, you give us the property back, we'll let you go scot-free, just let us have our house back. Like I said, even a mortgage company, back during 2008, when the housing market was collapsing, there was a lot of mortgage companies who were doing cash for keys. Now that's relatively rare, but it's still something that landlords do. And it's basically a way of short circuiting a long eviction process. So if you're in Fulton County, it can take a year to evict a tenant under the wrong circumstances. If you keep getting, mediation and then, a continuance on a court hearing and all this. So it makes sense in a lot of cases for a landlord to do cash for keys to get rid of the tenant as quickly as possible and not have to go through that. But the problem with that situation is, just know, if you're a landlord screening, if a tenant did that, a landlord let someone out of their lease for cash for keys, that will not show up because they're wiping out the balance basically. So there's very good reasons for landlords to do this from a business perspective, but just know you're not going to be able to know that if that situation occurs. So that could be a good reason, if you're an individual landlord out there trying to screen people, that you call prior landlords and talk to them. Now, a lot of them won't talk to you. A lot of them won't return phone calls, but do your best, try to reach out to them and find out, what the case is. Was this actually a responsible tenant or not?
That's a good point. on the rental verification, we do talk to past and current landlords. We get rental verifications. So it may not show up on the credit report, but if there's a very good chance that we're going to be told that the applicant did a cash for keys offer. I would hope they would tell us.
Yeah, hopefully. But you never know. You never know. I mean, that's one of those, like we'll talk about later, no screening is ever perfect. So, it's you can never catch everything. You just kind of go through and put enough layers in there that you catch as many as you possibly can. So yeah. All right. Next item you want to be checking for is bankruptcies and foreclosures. So this is something that a lot of people don't know, but if someone files a bankruptcy, they basically get all kinds of protections under the law. So not only are they not having to pay their bills, but it basically stops any sort of civil action that is in play, that is either already running or that you try to file. So a eviction is a civil action. So it's not a criminal case. It's a civil complaint. It's basically a case between two people. So if a tenant has a bankruptcy that's open, it's not closed out, it hasn't been disposed of by the court, then you basically can't evict them without going to bankruptcy court and getting a special approval from the bankruptcy judge to move forward with the eviction case. So not only can you not evict the tenant, you can't even go to court and ask a local judge for a judgment against that tenant until you've got this bankruptcy issue resolved. So effectively, what this does for you as a landlord is it tacks on thousands of dollars in legal fees and delays your eviction process a month or two while you deal with federal bankruptcy court. And by the way, you can't represent yourself in federal bankruptcy court. You have to have a attorney who is licensed to practice in federal court. So, it becomes very, very difficult to deal with those situations. So, you want to very much screen out any sort of bankruptcies. If you're screening for tenants and they have a bankruptcy that's open, that should be like an immediate, no, we're not renting to this. That for us, when we're screening tenants, if they have an open bankruptcy, it's just it's just like if they had owed a prior landlord money. We will not rent to that person. There's no amount of money they can pay. Nothing can be done for us to approve that. Now, I will say on foreclosures, we're not quite as strict on that. And the reason for that is, especially, this, we don't see a lot of foreclosure. I have no idea when the last foreclosure we actually saw on an application screening was, but we used to see a ton of them back in 2008 to 2012, kind of in that post, global financial crisis era. That's starting to feel longer and longer in the past. We used to see a bunch of foreclosures. And the reason was a bunch of people got these variable interest rate loans and they weren't expecting the interest rates to spike. And they got themselves into this situation where they got a foreclosure on their record. So they still made a ton of money. They still had a lot of credit. They, everything else on their background check was fantastic. They just got foreclosed on because their mortgage spiked from $2,000 a month to $3,000 a month overnight. But they can still afford to rent a place that's $2,000 a month. So, that we look at a little bit different. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Have you seen those situations, Zach? I know that was, 2008 was a little bit before you were in the industry, but any thoughts on that situation?
Yeah, I got the ball rolling in like 2016, but I do remember the first time Tamara was telling me before I was licensed, she helped move in another real estate agent And we were confused. Why don't you just rent one of your company's properties? So she ended up filing for bankruptcy a week later. I remember hearing about that. That was my first experience with it. I've never seen homeowner who was foreclosed on. Never had to process an app where someone was foreclosed on. Did approve a couple homeowners who were selling, and they were selling a house and needed a place in the meantime to rent. So I dealt with a couple of those. Bankruptcies it is a nightmare. Most of the time, I believe it's just going to be professional tenants who do this, who know the rules, who know the laws, and know that this is their best chance to stay in a place for free. Now, of course, if someone needs to file for bankruptcy, they can, and that's going to show up. But I have seen it as a tactic by professional tenants. And yes, it does. I believe you have to. Todd's right. You can't hire a regular attorney. It goes to state or federal court, and you have to file what's called a lift of stay. Is that right, Todd?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it becomes a huge nightmare. It is, and it kind of just circles back to the income verification, and you want to make sure they make enough money, and there's no way they're going to file for bankruptcy. If they make 3 times the monthly rent and income, everything's good on paper. There's just a lot that goes into making sure they're a good fit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point to tie it back to the income verification. Is this sort of problem is a lot less likely to occur if you're getting a real positive income verification and they're making the money and they don't have collections accounts. It's hard to file bankruptcy when you make a lot of money and you don't have any debt.
That's
so
right.
I mean, that kind of solves that problem. But I will say, still not 100%. Sometimes people will get divorced and then suddenly a fantastic financial situation becomes a nightmare for someone. And, they're left supporting a house on 1 income instead of 2. And so there's nothing that's ever perfect, but, still, I mean, you can vastly reduce your risk by doing a good income verification. And everything.
One more point to tack onto that. I don't think we can even send notices, pay or quits, if they file for bankruptcy. So we can't even send them the letter that says pay your rent or get out. So a lot of rent
calls. Can't do anything. You're basically stopped dead in your tracks until you get that motion to lift stay approved by the bankruptcy judge. So yeah, it's a crazy situation. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. Keep that in mind. You definitely want to avoid those situations as best you can. Next item, criminal history. So this is actually less of an issue than you think it is. We actually run into very few cases where we actually find criminal history in people's backgrounds when we're screening. Typically, people who have a criminal background, I'll just be honest, even if you're, I don't know who's in our audience today, if you're an individual landlord, you're more likely to be targeted by, people with a criminal background if you're an individual landlord as opposed to if you're a property manager, because they're looking for someone who's not going to do a thorough background check. So they know that their criminal history is going to pop up if they apply to a property management company or an apartment complex, because they know all those companies are going to run a thorough background check. This is where you can get yourself in trouble if you're not checking this stuff, because they're trying out individual landlords to see if they can find someone who doesn't check their criminal history. So very, very important. Now, I will say, though, there's federal guidance on this. So if you look at what HUD says, you can't deny someone just for any criminal background. That HUD says that's not allowed. That's considered discriminatory. And there's a lot that goes into that. There was some case law history on something that's called disparate impact, where the Supreme Court basically said that there are classes of people who have higher criminal background or criminal histories just because the police targeted them more, or their communities were more tightly policed, or whatever the case may be. So, you can't just say, okay, someone was convicted of possessing a gram of marijuana, so now I'm not going to rent to them. That's not really allowed. Now, that said, if someone killed someone in a DUI, or if someone stole $10,000 worth of equipment, or they vandalized a property, all of those things are legit. And, basically what HUD says, if it happened within the previous 7 years and it was a conviction, then you can deny someone's application for those things. So what our policy is at Revolution is we basically say any crime against people or property within the past 7 years, any felony is an automatic denial. So we're not going to rent to you in those cases. But be careful on this. If you're an individual landlord, go and actually read the HUD documentation on what you're allowed to check for and what you're not allowed to deny for. Because if you, for example, we get landlords who, will approve a tenant, and then the landlord will see the lease and they'll go and search the internet for their name, and they'll see that there was someone with a similar name was arrested, 2 years ago or something like that. That doesn't matter. You can't go by that. Number one, a Google search is not considered a reliable background check. But number two, an arrest isn't something you're allowed to deny somebody for. You have to have a criminal conviction in order to deny someone for a rental property. So be very careful on this. Zach, anything to add to that?
Yes, thank you. When I'm bringing on new accounts, the three big ones I always run by them. Well, really, we don't care if they had a DUI in 1995 or if they got caught with a gram of marijuana in 1998. We do not care. What we are more interested in is violent crimes, crimes against property, like vandalism. That's a big one. If we're screening an application for them to move in, and money crimes, check fraud, forgery, anything that's going to indicate they're going to have a hard time paying rent.
Yeah, excellent point on the financial crimes. I forgot to mention that. That's a big one. If someone has a history of passing bum checks, obviously that's a problem. So if they've been convicted of that, you definitely want to keep an eye on those sorts of things. So yeah, definitely pay attention to criminal background, but be careful about how you pay attention to it. You need to run it, but you need to be familiar with what the HUD guidance says as to what you're allowed to do. So just keep that in mind. Next item, credit. And I'm sure there's people out there watching this right now who are wondering, why have we waited so long to bring up credit when we've talked about all these other things? And the honest answer on this is we just do not find that there's very much correlation between someone's credit score and how good of a tenant they're going to be. Like I said, we've been in business since 2008 at this point, almost 20 years we've been managing. We manage thousands and thousands of properties at this point across 2 states. We've screened thousands upon thousands of applicants because when you take into account the fact that sometimes we have 50 applications for one vacant property, just do the math and you can see how many tens of thousands of applications we process now. And we just don't see that this is a big factor in whether someone is going to pay well or whether they're going to take good care of the property. And part of the reason for that is the credit score isn't really designed for that. A credit score was really designed to figure out how good is someone going to be on a traditional loan product. How well are they going to pay if they're getting a mortgage or a car loan? That's who credit scores were designed for, to figure that kind of thing out. And for some reason, it just doesn't correlate that much with a tenant renting a property. We kept data on this, and when you look at the data, if you look at someone who has a 550 credit score compared to someone with a 750, the eviction rate really isn't that much different. They basically all line up the same as long as we're screening everybody out for the other stuff we've talked about. Now, I'm sure if we weren't checking their income and, if we weren't doing a positive income verification and checking their rental history and their evictions, if we just went by credit score, maybe there would be a stronger correlation there, but we're not. And any good landlord shouldn't be. You should be checking all those other things. And those are typically going to be the ones that screen someone out. And once you get past those barriers, if they make the money, they're not a criminal, they haven't been evicted before, they don't have collections accounts, the credit score is just not going to tell you that much. So, we do check credit and we increase someone's security deposit amount based on credit. We will charge them risk mitigation fees if they've got a lower credit score. But for us, it's not the major thing we're looking at. Zach, what are your thoughts on credit scores?
The last point you made is a big one. We do look at credit. If someone has a not acceptable credit score, this is considered. They will be paying a higher deposit. It is looked at. It is considered. Number two is things are not moving as fast as they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Things have slowed down a little bit past COVID. Your pool of potential renters is not that big. Things are still moving, but if you cut out, say you made it a 700, which is reasonable, 700. If you declined everyone below, I'm sorry, it would be not reasonable to do that. My point is, if you made the cutoff 700, there's not that many people left who have a good enough credit score to rent your house. So it's like Todd said, there's not a huge link to eviction rates and credit. More importantly, your pool of renters. There's not. I mean, it's still going to take a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. If you cut out half of your available renters, it's going to take way longer. Your property is going to be on the market another month, and it's just going to cost you money in the long run.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I just pulled up some data here on the average credit scores. The average credit score in the United States is 715. So, that kind of gives you an idea of that. And the median is basically the same. So it's about 715. So like Zach said, basically, if you set the credit score at, say, 700, you're basically cutting out half of the available population in the entire country. So, our population is somewhere around 350 million in this country. So you've just wiped out 175 million available tenants when you say, I want a minimum credit score of 700. And, this is the reason this becomes a problem is landlords tend to be people who have better credit. They own property. In fact, they own more than one property since they're renting one out. They obviously live in one also. So generally a landlord has a pretty decent credit score. And sometimes, they can be very good credit scores, 800, 825, pushing up against the 850 top. And so sometimes landlords will get an idea that that's normal, that it's, everybody I know, in my white collar job has a 750 plus credit score. So that's what I want to look for. Well, very few people actually have that kind of credit score. And people don't realize that, how rare that is. If you start to get up to doing a cutoff at 750, you could be wiping out 3/4 of your available tenants. So you got to really keep that in mind. And that's especially true depending on your class of property. So, if you're renting out an A-class property and, that's the only property you're renting, okay, you can be a lot more picky about that because almost anybody who has the money to afford that property is probably going to have a pretty good credit score also. Unless they went through a divorce or something like that, they're probably going to be doing pretty well. But if you're renting out, say, a C-class duplex in Griffin, Georgia, you're not going to find anybody who's interested in renting that property with a credit score probably above 600, to be honest with you. That's just not going to exist. If you set that, then you could be waiting 6 months to rent that property. And it's just not worth that because the risk of eviction, if you check everything else, is so low. As long as you're verifying everything else and they're making the money and all the other things are taken care of, then there's no reason for you to sit around and wait that long trying to rent that property. So very, very good point by Zach there as to how this impacts leasing. And I'll just throw it out there since he brought that up. Our, traditional average time to lease a property was only about 14 days in the past. If you went back a few years, we're currently sitting at 35 days. So, this is not a great market. And Zach knows we got a community of property managers where we all email each other in the Atlanta market. Everybody was talking, I think it was either this morning or yesterday, about how slow the market is right now. So, I mean, this is a widespread problem, not just in this state, but everywhere. So you want to screen. You always want to screen your tenants, but you don't want to be too picky. Remember that.
Agreed.
All right, next, fair housing and discrimination concerns. So this is very important because there is a misconception among some landlords that there is no requirement for an individual landlord to follow fair housing law. And that is not true. Now, there are some differences if you're an individual landlord as opposed to a property manager or apartment complex or something like that. There's not as many restrictions on you. But you still have to follow all laws when it comes to non-discriminatory advertising. If you own more than, I believe it's 7 properties in the state of Georgia, you are basically treated like a corporate landlord. So you have to have trust accounts. You have to follow all fair housing laws. You have to keep a trust account. All this stuff has to be done just as if you were a licensed real estate brokerage. So you want to be really careful on this when you're dealing with fair housing because application screening is the number one place where you can get hit with fair housing issues. They literally have what they call testers that work for HUD who will call around to landlords at random and ask questions. So they'll call and they'll ask a question like, okay, I have a marijuana conviction from 3 years ago. Will you rent to me? Or they'll say something like, oh, I've got 3 children. I'm a single mom. Can I rent from you? And then they're just waiting for a landlord to say something like, oh, well, this is really not a community for families. We don't, the neighbors don't really like children. I actually had a landlord tell me that not too long ago. It's someone that I can't remember if we had signed them up or we were about to sign them up, but they had sent me something about, oh, we really don't, the people in the neighborhood don't like children. We don't want to rent to children. And I said, well, too bad. You don't have a choice in that. That's the law. You can't discriminate against people because they have kids. It doesn't matter what the people in the neighborhood think or anything else, unless it's a 55 plus community. That's a difference. But unless it's actually certified that way and meets the federal requirements for that, then you cannot discriminate on race, national origin. And by the way, that national origin is a big one right now with everybody so focused on immigration. You cannot say, I'm not going to rent to someone because they lived in or they're from Mexico or El Salvador, or whatever the case may be. You have to rent to everybody, regardless of where they're from, what their skin color is, what their religion is. None of that can be something that you can take into consideration. So always keep that in mind. Always remember that this is just something that get you hit in all kinds of trouble, because fair housing violations can be very expensive, very difficult. And what I always, because I teach property managers also, and when I speak at conferences and those sort of things, I always remind everybody when I do that this is one of the few areas in America where you are guilty until proven innocent. That's the way fair housing law is written. You have to basically prove that you didn't violate the law. So it's not incumbent upon the government to show that you did violate it. It's incumbent upon you to show, oh, no, here's what I made my decision based on. And you have to be able to show that. So always keep that in mind. Zach, anything to add on the fair housing issues?
Of course. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important things they teach you in the Georgia real estate course. It's very important. This is the number one way to, in my opinion, to lose your real estate license is getting wrapped up in a fair housing lawsuit. There's protected classes. You cannot Todd's 100% correct. You can't discriminate. You really can't discriminate based on anything except how much money they make. The metrics that we're looking for. We can discriminate based on income. So I know that sounds, discriminatory, but it's not. We do need to prove that. Number two, this is why we don't let our owner clients preview or approve our applications, because they could look at it and they could say one thing. They're not licensed. Most of them are. We do have a couple agents we work with, but it may not be an issue, but it is certainly opening the door for a fair housing violation. So you can't, and I've seen it before too. A lot of people don't know this. You cannot put, I'm sure a lot of licensees don't know this. You cannot put perfect for families in your listing. It is, that's discriminatory. You're discriminating. Familial status is a protected class. So that's it. Just don't discriminate. This is the most important thing. And when I do my continuing education every couple of years, this is all, I always review this. If I retain anything, it is fair housing laws. So that is so important.
Yeah, that's a great thing that Zach pointed out there as far as advertising. There's a lot of things that people don't realize are kind of inadvertently discriminatory. They don't intend for it to be. So, a perfect example of this would be something like, let's say you're trying to be very, diverse, and you're trying to be someone who's very progressive and that sort of thing. So you put out an ad that says, this neighborhood is right next to a mosque and there's a large Muslim community, and you're trying to feel, you're trying to make it look like you're welcoming of people who are, of the Muslim faith. That is considered discriminatory because you're making it seem like it's not a place welcome for non-Muslims. Someone could perceive it that way. Same thing if you say, oh, a church is in the neighborhood, or whatever the case may be. You can't say those things in advertising, or you can't say those things if someone calls you. That, like I said, they'll have these testers that try to catch you on this stuff. So just be very, very careful on that kind of stuff. And this is why it's so important to have a licensed real estate brokerage, a property manager, manage your property, because there's so many places you can get in trouble on this kind of stuff that you don't even think about. Okay, so let's talk about AI. And, I know when I go to conferences and everything, everybody's tired of talking about AI. It seems to be the only thing that's on the news. It's on Facebook. Everybody's talking about AI all the time. But I think it is important to highlight this for a minute, because AI is actually starting to become a problem when it comes to screening applicants. And that might not seem obvious right off the bat, but the reason is it's very simple, very easy nowadays to fake documents. You can go in and you can ask ChatGPT or Grok or Claude or whatever your favorite AI is to create a fake pay stub, or to, create a fake tax return. And some of them might do it, some of them might not. There's different controls that are put in place for different AI, but a lot of people don't realize that you can create your own AI. We work with companies who actually do that, where they don't use like OpenAI or Grok or anything like that. They created their own large language model. So people can go out who are good with tech. They can create their own that has no restrictions on it. It'll build whatever for them they want it to build. And then they can just load in a pay stub and say, replace all the information on this pay stub with this information that I want it to say. And you have to be very careful about this stuff, because the old ways of screening tenants don't work anymore. If your previous policy was the way we check for income verification is we look at pay stubs, well, I got news for you. Go to Google right now and search fake pay stubs and see what comes up. Thousands upon thousands of results. There are literally companies out there that will sell you fake pay stubs. There are even companies that will do fake employment verifications where you can call, they'll give you a phone number out. And then if someone calls that phone number to verify that you work there, they'll pretend to be the employer. They'll do landlord verifications. They'll do all kinds of stuff. So you really have to be careful about this stuff. And this is why having a multi-layered approach to doing your tenant screening is so important, because they might be able to sneak one past you on something, but you'll catch them on something else if you're doing a full-fledged screening. So, Zach, thoughts on this?
Yes, and this is important. I asked Todd to put this on the topic for the webinar. I've seen it. Fraud is so real. It was real. It was, it's pretty common before AI was powerful enough to generate fake documents. So it takes a trained eye. It really does. I've seen fake IDs. I've seen fake check stubs, and I don't mean AI generated. I have seen some of that stuff, but I have seen a lot of applicants over the years trying to pull a fast one on a property management company. And if you're doing it by yourself and you don't know what to look out for, you are crazy. There is way too much liability in screening an application yourself. Especially considering the new technology that we have and everyone has, really. So Todd nailed it. Fake check stubs, fake at the push of a button. So we have a lot of good software that we like to use, and Todd will review applications manually. I think the staff does most of it, but Todd is the one who's going to put the final say so on this person. He's going to review everything. Long story short, we know what to look out for. It's crazy to do it yourself. There's liability in having a good company do it. It's a lot less liability. It is a much better choice to have a professional company screen whoever is going to be living in your investment property for at least the next 12 months.
Yeah. I mean, Zach's right. I mean, there are cases where I actually have to personally take a look at an application. It's rare. Normally we're able to do it regularly, but I did this the other day and I can't remember what it was about, but I could not tell if a document was legit or not. And so I took the document and I actually took it over to AI and I loaded it in and I said, hey, search this document for signs of tampering or anything. And it came back and said, oh, here are 3 red flags. These fonts look like they're irregular, and it'll find stuff. So you can actually use AI to find fraudulent AI, so I mean, but the average landlord wouldn't even think to do that. And,
No.
that's kind of the problem here, and why you need to have that professional help to make sure that you're doing that. Because if we see something that doesn't look right, we're going to dig deeper. Doesn't mean we're always going to catch it. I mean, we do evict tenants. I mean, there is no property management company on earth who doesn't occasionally have to evict a tenant, but we're going to have it happen a whole lot less often than an individual landlord does. In fact, statistically, we evict about 1/10 as many tenants as the national average for individual landlords. So keep that in mind. Next, it doesn't just stop at the tenant. So, obviously we want to screen the tenant. We want to make sure that we're checking all their credit, income, all that kind of stuff. But tenants have pets. So, that's something else you have to be screening for. And this was something that up until I'd say probably about 10 years ago, not a lot of landlords paid a lot of attention to, was pet screening. But something that's happened over the past couple of decades is the number of people who have pets has skyrocketed, particularly in post-COVID. So before COVID, the number had already gone up to about 40% of households in the US have a pet. Now it's up to 60%. So, that number grew a lot during the pandemic, and it never pulled back. There was kind of a thought, oh, maybe after the pandemic is over and everyone goes back to work and all that, people will start to have fewer pets. That didn't happen. We're now, 4 years post-COVID, and that pet rate has stayed up there at 60%. So as a landlord, you want to keep this in mind, because like Zach was talking about earlier with credit scores, you can't just eliminate 60% of the tenant population by saying we're not going to rent to people with pets. So you got to allow pets in some way or another. So, you got to be careful about it though. So there's a big difference between a, Staffordshire Terrier with a history of biting people as compared to a Shih Tzu that's 12 pounds and, is elderly and isn't going to harm a fly. Those are two very different pets with two very different risk profiles. So we screen pets just like we screen tenants. So every single person who applies to rent from us, they have to go through a pet screening process. So they either have to fill out an affidavit where they testify under oath that they have no pets and they're not going to get any pets, in which case their lease will say no pets. Or they have to give us all the information on their pet. So they have to provide photos, vaccination records, information on their veterinarian, insurance that they have for the pet, all this kind of stuff. And then we put together a risk profile for what that pet looks like. And then we charge pet fees and then provide a pet damage guarantee to our clients. So we're basically protecting our landlord clients from the possibility of pet damage while still allowing people who have pets to rent from us. So it's making it to where we're not having that problem of screening out all these people, but we're still taking care of the risk. Zach, what thoughts on pets? As I know you've probably got a couple of cats roaming somewhere around the room.
This is my favorite topic by far. I wish we could do a webinar just on pet stuff one day.
Maybe we will.
Dogs. Yeah, I have cats. I got some creatures. You could probably see the back of my chair is all clawed up. My lazy boy. Anyways, 60% of people do have a cat or a dog or something. And just as Todd said, if you remove that, your pool of renters is, if you remove all the pet owners, you're going to sit on the market for a long time. You may find someone, but you're really just cutting your tenants in half, over half. Everyone's got a cat or a dog. And if that tenant, that prospective applicant sees no pets on the Zillow listing, they aren't going to look twice. They aren't going to be interested. It's like saying you can't bring your kids. So that's important. Let me see. That's it. And I get it. The reason people wouldn't like pets, some people have a better reason than other owner clients. I would say the most common one that I see is someone has engineered hardwood floors, or they've seen some pet damage and they don't want dogs to come in and scratch it up. And it's possible. We need to allow pets, but in return, we have you covered on so many bases. We have property damage guarantees. We have pet damage guarantees. We still hold, on top of that, we still hold the tenants accountable for their pets and their damage with their security deposit, and they're still responsible. So there's a lot that goes into it. You don't want to just remove all pets from the possibility. So hiring a good company, we have guarantees in place to protect you. Um, if anything happens, I think it's a 5K pet damage guarantee that we pay for out of pocket, Todd.
3,000 on the
Yeah.
pet side, total of 5,000 for property damage. But yeah,
That is and I've seen some pet damage. I've seen some scratch back doors and some slightly frayed carpet. We also do inspections, and there's a little side inspection we do for pet inspections. We want to see their bed. We want to see their stuff. We want to make sure there is the one pet there, and it is who they say they are, and they don't have they're not running a zoo in the basement. So the inspections are important too. So everything's controlled. We take care of we're pet friendly, is what I'm trying to say.
excellent, excellent. Very good. So we talked about a ton of things that we want to watch for in tenant screening. What about things we don't want to actually screen for? So this is an interesting topic because I listen to some real estate and investment podcasts. I'm obviously on, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's a website called Bigger Pockets, which is a big investor community for real estate investors, which are great resources, by the way. But I'll tell you, there's also some really crazy information that kind of comes across these things sometimes. So, one of the most common things I'll see in these forums and everything is advice on screening tenants. And you'll have some landlord who jumps in and says, "Oh, I want to see how clean their car is," or, I want to meet their kids so I can see how well dressed they are. These kinds of things. And these are not ways to screen tenants, folks. I don't care whatever, some crusty old landlord on Bigger Pockets tells you. There is never anybody who's prevented an eviction by checking to see how clean someone's car is. Some of the most responsible people I know on earth have some of the most dirty, just nasty. I'll just say my father is a perfect example of this. His car just has coffee cups everywhere. Man's worth millions of dollars at this point, but he can't take care of a car to save his life. That's not unusual. So if you're denying a tenant on that basis, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You could have had a fantastic tenant. And this goes back to what Zach was saying about pets too. If you're filtering out someone just on that basis, then you could be passing up on an amazing tenant just because they've got a pet. This could be someone with an 825 credit score who makes 8 times the rent, never defaulted on any bill in their life, but you're not going to rent to them because they haven't washed their car in 6 months or they've got a cat. These are not things that you want to be paying attention to. So when you're doing tenant screenings, the best advice I can give you is remember what this is about is 2 different things. Are they going to pay their bills? So financial stuff. And are they going to take good care of the property? Are they going to leave with it being in as good a condition as they got it? That's all that matters here. It doesn't matter what kind of profession they're in or what kind of pets they got or what kind of car they drive or any of this other stuff. None of that matters. All that matters is how responsible are they going to be with your house and are you going to make money off of it? That's all that matters here. So, that's my thought. Zach, anything to add to that?
Just some of the things we touched on before, things not to screen for, things that are going to get you in trouble. Fair housing is number 1. But yeah, I was a renter. I rented from Todd years ago. If someone wanted to come out and look at my car, I would say, no, I will go live somewhere else. It's clean. It's clean enough, but it's still, I would feel some type of way if someone was making a decision to approve me as a tenant if they were going to base it on my car or really anything else besides how much money I make. And, if I owe any landlords money, just focus on the important stuff. Don't worry about their car, their maker model, or how they dress or their work hours, or, I would even stay off their social media for the most part. I know a lot of landlords who will go searching on social media, looking for stuff, and really, the most important ones is money, making sure they make enough money, and making sure they don't have any crazy vandalism charges. Rental verifications are important, employment verifications are important. That's my whole point.
Gotcha. All right. So we've covered the things you're supposed to look for. We've covered the things you shouldn't pay attention to. The last thing I really want to cover here is to, before we get into our guarantees and talk about what we can do for you, is we want to make sure everybody understands that no screening can prevent every problem. So you can have the best screening process. You can be doing this for, like us, for decades. You know, you could have screened thousands upon thousands of tenants and have every experience point you could possibly get when it comes to this and be very thorough. And there's still going to be some people who slip through the cracks. There's nothing that's ever perfect. You know, like I said, there's records that have been sealed, or, you know, or like I said, someone could just be, they could have had the most responsible life up to this point, but then they get diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and now their life is in a shambles as they try to go through cancer treatment. And the next year, 2 years is just going to be a nightmare. And because of that, they can't go to their job, and they start losing money, and then everything falls into disarray. You know, there was no way you possibly could have, you know, known that, you know, unless you're clairvoyant somehow and you can see into the future, then there's no way you're ever going to be able to screen for that. So I always want to point out to people, no matter how good your screening process is, please understand your property manager, whether it's us or another property manager, just because they put someone in the property who had to be evicted doesn't mean their screening process was bad. It could just be they got diagnosed with cancer, or they got divorced, or, you know, maybe a kid died and that just threw their life into there's a million different situations we've seen over the years. So you just never know what's going to happen. And any of those things can create a situation where someone's going to fall behind. So all you can do as a landlord is have the best possible screening process you can. That'll reduce your risk to the greatest possible extent. And then most likely you're not going to have any problems. Like I said, for us, our eviction rate is under 1%. So we pretty consistently stay down at around 0.5%, 0.75%, in that range for what our eviction rate is with the way we screen tenants. But keep in mind, we manage hundreds of properties. So if your eviction rate is 0.5% and you're managing a couple hundred properties, someone's still getting evicted. You know, I mean, that's there's no way to avoid that. No system is ever 100%. So some landlord this year is going to have an eviction that we could not have prevented. You know, that's just the way it is. So keep that in mind. And then we'll wrap up with Zach kind of talking about, he mentioned some of those guarantees earlier. I want Zach to kind of talk about these slate of guarantees that we offer people, and emphasis on, this is guarantees that we provide when we place tenants. So, you know, it's not something you can just buy an insurance policy or something from us. We have to actually place the tenant. So Zach, talk about that.
If you let me, I would take 10 minutes and give whoever's listening the whole pitch. But yeah, we do guarantee, and I would like to say first, I think I mentioned this before, doing it yourself is crazy. Hiring a property management company, hiring us, gives you some protections. We guarantee the tenants we place. First of all, if a tenant that we place, if they don't finish their lease term, if they do have to be evicted, we place the next tenant for free. Placement's expensive. There's a lot that goes into it. Marketing and pro photos and screening. We don't necessarily want to place your next tenant for free. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure they are a good fit to live there and pay rent on time. We also do inspections. This isn't necessarily part of our guarantees when placing tenants, but they are important. We have a leasing guarantee on our gold plan. And it's basically, if your property's on the market longer than 21 days, on our gold plan, we're not going to charge you a leasing fee. So you have a wonderful placement guarantee on that, while you have a professional company screening potential tenants. So it's just a win-win. We have property damage guarantees and placement guarantees, but the good tenant guarantee is applicable. I think that's on our silver plan and gold plan. But we guarantee our placements. And that's a good point to make on that, is that, you know, doing it yourself is crazy. hiring us is the best choice when it comes to, there's just too much risk involved. We've been doing it a very long time. And that's it.
Yeah. And I would say if you're not in the Atlanta market, if your property's somewhere else, feel free to reach out to us too, because we've got a network of property managers across the country where we can tell you who is a good property manager who can help you, that has the same standards and everything that we have, so that they can make sure you're protected. We're happy to help with that too. Just feel free to reach out. But yeah, plenty of guarantees we have to offer. We've kind of walked through everything we do to screen tenants and to protect you as a landlord. So hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to us. You can always reach us at support@revolutionrm.com. Someone will get back to you usually within a few minutes, usually, if you reach out to us. So appreciate everybody joining us for our webinar. We will be back. It'll be at the end of December, so probably right after the holiday. We'll be back with our next webinar, and maybe we'll do like Zach said and talk about pets. We'll get an announcement out to everybody. And if you missed any of this webinar, we will be sending out a recording of this later. So watch for that in your inbox. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. See you later.